Okay, I'm just gonna tell you about two things about Plato. What I love about Plato and what I hate about Plato. I think it's, what do I think about Plato? Well, I've got some good news and some bad news, and I think most people do about Plato have sort of mixed feelings. Most people have mixed feelings. First of all, it's kind of funny. I asked one of the 70 in our church what he thought about Plato, and he said Plato was a fool. And I went away musing about that because, ironically, this is sort of Socratic irony here. I wasn't sure whether this 70 knew Plato well enough to be engaging in Socratic irony in that statement, or whether it was just flat, unexamined. Plato was a fool, But Plato would have been the first to agree with the statement that Plato is a fool. That's sort of the whole point that Socrates made, that there's two kinds of people in the world. There are the wise, there are the fools who think that they are wise, and the wise who know that they are fools. Now, Plato would have considered, in the context of this Socratic irony, Socratic foolishness, he would have considered being called a fool a compliment. It's like that guy from the Joker blogs, It's a compliment, So that's something that you have to like about Plato. He has a certain humility. At least I really think that humility comes from Socrates, which Plato, of course, is writing about. Another thing you can love about Plato is that none of his or Socrates' ideas depend on Socrates being a real person in any way at all. It doesn't matter to any of the teachings of Socrates whether Socrates is a real person or not at all. It doesn't matter. It makes absolutely no difference to any Platonist. None. Because part of the point of the Socratic method, the philosophical method of thinking, is that it doesn't matter who is saying something. It only matters whether that statement is true or not. So that's another thing to love about Plato, is his recognition of the nature of truth. But really, it might be better to talk about Socrates. Now, I have sort of two things to say about the Socratic problem. First, in terms of philosophically speaking, the historical Socratic problem, the problem of where you draw the line between the ideas of Socrates and the ideas of Plato, because Plato wrote all of his ideas except the laws as if they were coming from Socrates. So it's nearly impossible to sort out where Socrates ends and Plato's own ideas begin. But it doesn't matter quite so much. It doesn't matter whether Socrates exists. It only matters whether what Socrates in Plato's writing says is true or not. And sometimes it's not. But you see, the first point that Plato makes is the point about wisdom and foolishness, and that we're all fools, and we have to admit it. And if we admit it, that is the start of wisdom, right? The Socratic humility to realize that you have no idea what you're talking about. Okay? And I think when the Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and when Plato says something like, that the wise man is the one who knows that he is a fool, I think those two statements are very, very close together. They could be really the same idea, almost. And there are a great many things in Plato or great many things in the Bible that I think are echoed in Plato. Well, now here's the trouble. Here's where here's the bad news. There's the good news. Here's the bad news. Plato was a terrible politician. He was a fairly decent ethicist, but a terrible politician. And in his thinking, and in the thinking of his age, there was no clear division at all between the study of ethics and the study of politics. I don't think that other than blatantly unjust laws, which really aren't laws at all, for them, I don't think any ancient Greek would have been able to explain the difference between illegal and unethical, right? So, like the RIAA, they wouldn't be able to sort out the ethical question of whether it's okay to do file sharing from the legal question. Things like that would be completely beyond their comprehension, not because of the technology involved, because of their inability to sort out ethics and politics. Plato adds to this his idea that the city is like the man in the Republic, which really eliminates any possibility of distinguishing between politics and ethics, and that leads him down all kinds of wrong paths and all kinds of confusion. Now, at the same time, he does distinguish between, ethical and unethical governments, just as there are ethical and unethical men. So he's not entirely off track there, of course. I would agree with Plato that a good and just king is one of the best governments you can possibly have, as long as the king remains good and just. If the king then becomes unjust, then it's one of the most terrible forms of government you can have, and that was our experience in the American Revolution. So, there's a lot of good stuff in Plato, but there's a lot of bad stuff too. And here's the thing. The biggest problem with Plato, I think, is that he loses his first love. Okay? If you look at what are called the early dialogues of Plato, the trial and death of Socrates being the most prominent example, being the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and to a lesser extent the Phaedo. These early dialogues are more concerned with goading you to think for yourself, prodding you to think for yourself. Right? For the early dialogues, it's really good enough if you examine what you're saying. What do you really mean? Is your position defensible or not? In other words, is your position philosophical? Are you doing philosophy? If you're doing philosophy at all, in Plato's early period, you're doing pretty good. But as Plato gets older, in his middle and late period, it starts to be about himself, Plato and his ideas, not philosophy as such, not Socrates and his methods as such, but Plato and his particular ideas, his city, his theory of forms, his stuff. And once Plato starts to do that, he loses his first love. His dialogues become much more boring, and he starts to get into all kinds of confusions and things that look completely archaic now. He advocates the abolition of the family, for example, in the Republic. Things that are completely archaic. All this stuff about, making society completely unchanging, as though we can have a perfect society. And then later in the laws, he sort of backs away from that. But he introduces all kinds of other new, problems. He tries to, he gets away from what we call ethics and into what we call politics. And in the end, I think in some ways, becomes very like the sophists that he started to criticize in his early years. So the best Plato is the early stuff, and I think you find that in most artists, and I would regard Plato as an artist. His dialogues are not just abstract logical treatises like Aristotle's are. His dialogues are works of art. They've got symbolism in them. They've got levels of drama and irony in them, you know. A Socratic dialogue is a work of art. It's not just an abstract logical treatise or examination, you know, that just, you know, goes for the strict math and that's it. He loves math, but he doesn't make math all he writes about. He's not Pythagoras, in other words. So that's the good news and the bad news. There's some things about, you know, it said math is God's gift to Platonists. Well, another thing is you could say, in some ways, Plato is God's gift to theologians. Because Plato gives us he gives us a he stands up against relativism for absolutism. He stands up against naturalism for supernaturalism. And he stands for what I think we have now come to call social conservatism in many ways. And against most forms of tyranny. He has his own particular Platonic tyranny. I mean, we would never want to actually live in the Republic. But if you look at the Republic as an investigation not into the proper governing of the city, but into the nature of justice, it becomes a much more relevant and useful text. And in particular, in the Phaedo, Plato gets to the immortality of the soul. He was the defender of the immortality of the soul. And so Christians find lots and lots and lots to agree with and love about Plato. And of course modern people find a lot of, you know, political ideas to strongly dislike in Plato. So, you know, it's sort of it's a mixed bag. It's like anything. Plato certainly is doing a lot better than someone like Nietzsche, you know, who's full of all these dark sayings, you know. For any student of philosophy, Plato is the place to begin. Begin with the trial and death of Socrates, the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo. Begin with those, and if you like those, then see about continuing to study philosophy. Because Plato is really the place to start. Plato in his early period, talking about Socrates. And Socrates, in many ways, stands for philosophy. Socrates doesn't stand for Platonism so much as for philosophy, as opposed to sophistry. He stands for the examined life, as opposed to just assuming, you know, everything, you know. He's not a universal skeptic. He's not an atheist. You know, he is a Socratic. You know, he's Socrates. He is for, you know, prodding you to examine your ideas, think through what you're saying, what you really believe in, not to abandon what you believe in, but to think it through. So, in that sense, Socrates is one of my big heroes, of course. And another great thing about Socrates, and I think this is one of the best things you can say about anyone, is that in the Crito, which I think the Crito and the Euthyphro are competing in my mind for being the best Socratic dialogue. In the Crito, Socrates gives us a notion of the ultimate goal not being survival, of survival being subservient to our real ultimate goal. Survival is not the all-end-all, you know. There are some things that are more important, more valuable than survival. Your principles are more valuable than your life, for Socrates in the Crito. I don't agree with Socrates' particular principles in the Crito, but I do very deeply respect the notion that your principles are more valuable than your life, and the courage that is involved in taking that kind of a stand or living that kind of a life. One thing that really makes me think that the early dialogues and the later works of Plato are in contradiction is Socrates' great respect for Athens, for the government of Athens, so much that he would rather die than break the laws of Athens, even though Athens is a democracy. Plato, in his later dialogue, in his later works, hates democracy because it was a democracy that killed Socrates. But in the Crito, which is one of the earlier dialogues, he represents Socrates as being more willing to die than to break the laws of a democracy. I think this shows that there was a significant shift in Plato's thought, between the early dialogues and the late dialogues. And there are many other things that indicate to us that there's some arbitrary point that we've got to draw in the early dialogues for these were Socrates' ideas and these were Plato's ideas. But it's not a hard and fixed point, I mean, it's not real clear exactly where to draw that, And we can, reasonable people can disagree about where to draw the line. But I think some kind of line, it's reasonable to draw some kind of line between the thoughts of Plato and the thoughts of Socrates because of how we see Plato's, thought in his writings develop over time. Well, I think, I've pretty much spilled the contents of my brain on Plato for right now. So, all right, I'll see you guys next time.